Welcome back to the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. You're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day listening to who? The always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas. I'm a multimedia journalist and I'm a graphic designer, so please go check out my website, millardthomas24.myportfolio.com. On there you can see all my latest work, my packages, to my articles, to my photos, and my graphic design. You could follow more content by me. Just go to Twitter at CreatorThomas24 for my personal account, or look up Locked On Diamondbacks on both Twitter and Instagram for the podcast handle. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be doing this podcast without you, the listener. So thank you. We are free and available on all platforms. But what are we talking about today? Well, we got he's red hot right now. The Locked On Mets host, Ryan Finklestein. He's hopping on the pod today to discuss the Mets offseason, new ownership, even talk a little bit about the MLB Hall of Fame ballot. So it's going to be a jam-packed pod as always. He's been a superstar at the Locked On Network recently. So I feeling pretty good to have this guy on the podcast today. So we're going to bring him on shortly. But first, intro drop.
Locked On Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And as promised, let's bring on Locked On superstar Ryan Finklestein of Locked On Mets on the pod. Ryan, sir, how are you doing?
Doing good, man. I mean, how could I not be doing good after that glowing intro? I feel great about this. All right.
Yeah, go check out Locked On Mets on YouTube. They are crushing it. Definitely don't compare the numbers to the Locked On Diamondbacks YouTube page. But that's why we brought Ryan on, because we know he brings the views. And Ryan, the Mets offseason has gone crazy so far. The Rangers have probably been the two most fascinating teams to watch during this free agency period. They've been going hard. They've been going aggressive. There's some other teams doing some moves as well. But those are probably the two teams that have been doing the most. But before we even get to the offseason, Ryan, I want to talk a little bit about ownership, because this Mets franchise and their philosophy towards spending has really changed, radically changed, since they've gotten Steve Cohen. So I just want you to just illustrate for my Diamondbacks listeners who might not be too keen on the Mets of how much Steve Cohen has changed life in the Mets franchise after the Jeff Wilpon experience.
I think the perfect example is a couple of years ago, Zach Wheeler becomes a free agent and the Mets basically give him a qualifying offer and don't even talk to him. He signs with the Phillies. We've seen what's happened since, runner-up for the Cy Young. That was a very big point of contention for me, because I was screaming for a Wheeler extension that entire year prior to him hitting free agency. Now you have Noah Syndergaard gets offered a qualifying offer this year. He goes to another team, and the Mets respond by giving Max Scherzer $130 million over 3 years. So there's a big difference there, whereas last time the contingency plan after losing a guy on a qualifying offer was Michael Wacha and Rick Porcello. Now it's Max Scherzer. So I think that alone encapsulates the difference between the Wilpon era and the Cohen era.
Yeah, and the reason I bring it up, because I've been talking about this on my pod about how teams can just go into free agency and rebuild their whole team basically in one offseason, two off seasons if they want to. We see the Rangers. They were one of the worst teams in baseball last year. They were projected to have one of the worst teams in baseball going to next season. But now you add Corey Seager, you add John Gray, you add Marcus Semien. Now they're projected to maybe fight for a wild card spot. We'll see. The Mets are now projected, according to Fangraphs, to be arguably the best team on paper next season, I believe, according to either Fangraphs or Steamer. Those are one of those two things. So you can go into an offseason and basically rebuild your whole team if you're willing to spend money. And that's kind of the point I want to get to with the Mets' new ownership, because under the Jeff Wilpon era, I was looking it up. They used to be spending like a big market team when Jeff Wilpon first took over in the early 2000s. They were like top 5 in payroll from like 03 to 09 or something crazy. But then there was a little man named Bernie Madoff, and he basically took down the Mets franchise with his billion-dollar Ponzi scheme, took all the Mets money and Jeff Wilpon's money, and they basically had to start borrowing from the league. So the ownership is such a crucial point in baseball, because if you have a owner willing to spend, you can get any player you want. You can turn your team around quickly, and we've seen it with the Mets. We've seen it with the Rangers. If you have an owner willing to spend, that's where I want the D-backs to get to, a place where their owner wants to spend. So now that the Mets look like they're spending again, like under Steve Cohen, do you believe the Mets are officially back as a big market team? And when you look at free agents, do you think the Mets are now going to be in contention with the Yankees on all these guys of who are these players going to pick? Which New York team are these players going to pick if they want to come to the Big Apple?
I think they still have a lot of work to do when it comes to just shaking the narrative the Mets have had over the past couple of years. I mean, we saw with their GM search how drawn out that was. So many people did not want to come over, which I think is a little ironic now because Billy Upler got to spend $250 million in his first week on the job, which to me makes that job pretty attractive now. But I think there is a little bit that has to change when it just comes to the perception of the Mets, especially after last year and the way they collapsed. But there's no doubt about it. This is now a big market team. That is for sure. You want to get to a point where you don't necessarily have to overpay to get some of these guys to come over. I think that's what they're trying to build towards. The one thing I'll say about everything that we've seen play out this offseason, the Mets in the state of their farm system would probably be in a rebuild right now. And what they're essentially doing is they're rebuilding their farm system. They're investing a ton in their scouting, their analytics, all that stuff, their player development. Meanwhile, they're going to have a $300 million payroll on the field trying to win the next couple of years as they're trying to build out that infrastructure. So I think what the Mets are going to look like in 3 years is going to be a little bit different than right now. I don't expect Steve Cohen to have a $300 to $350 million payroll every single year. But for the next 2 or 3 years, they're going to be huge spenders. And then moving forward, I think they'll try to get a little bit closer to what the Dodgers have done out on the West Coast, where, yeah, you spend, but you can spend a little bit more wisely.
Yeah, and that's basically my overarching point when it comes to ownership, because the Mets, even though they played in New York, they were a small market team. Once that Bernie Madoff scandal happened, you bring in Steve Cohen, they're back to a big market team. So in baseball, any team, there's not really an idea of small market or big market in baseball. There's glamour markets, of course, but free agents in baseball historically really don't care about going to glamour markets. Of course, it's always nice to go to the New Yorks or the LAs, but honestly, most free agents just want to get the bag. They just want to secure their money, because we have this CBA lockout right now where players are trying to get to free agency quicker. The 6 years of Major League service time, they want to get to free agency quicker. They want to get paid faster. So a big reason why players didn't care about big market teams is because they've been waiting 6 years to get to free agency. They're going to take that first big bag that comes to them. They're not going to wait for, oh, let me see what the Yankees have to offer. Maybe they could top the offer I got from the Cleveland Guardians or something. Like, free agents just want to go where the money was. So historically, if you had an owner willing to spend, your team was going to be in pretty good shape. The D-backs are a team that always tries to be around league average and live on the margins. But if you don't have an infrastructure like the Rays or the Oakland A's, it's just not going to work. So I want the D-backs to get to a point where they're maybe not the Mets spending $300 million in the offseason, but get to a better place where they're putting a little bit more competitive product on the field. I know that's what the CBA lockout negotiations are supposed to do. But when you look back at last season, Ryan, what do you think went wrong with the Mets? I know there was a lot of injuries with this team, but do you think there was also poor play? Was the defense? Like, I was a guy who, of course, wasn't watching the Mets every day. Like, how can you explain this collapse that the Mets had in the second half of the season?
I think the biggest thing you can point to is Jacob deGrom getting hurt. I mean, he was, in my opinion, the favorite to win the MVP after the first half. He was putting up just ridiculous numbers offensively as well as on the mound. And then you lose him, and I think that had such a carryover, not only just to lose his production, but to lose that leadership on the field every 5 days. So I think that was the biggest thing. You know, they went right out of the break and they lost Lindor and deGrom. And they actually held their heads above water a little bit more in July than they did once they got Lindor back. But that's not necessarily based on his play. So it was really deGrom going down. And I think the entire first half of the year, I've used this analogy on my show, it was almost like the Mets were holding on to the division lead. Like if you had your dog and you're walking it, but you just have his leash around your wrist, you're not really holding on to it. It's just, the dog's not going to go anywhere. That's it. They were maintaining that division lead. And they were never holding on to it. They were never in fear that the dog was going to take off. And that dog was the Braves, who took off, grabbed the division, and won the World Series. So I think the Mets really were resting on their laurels all year in the first half, never quite creating that separation. And it came back to haunt them.
Are you worried about the injuries with the Jacob deGrom? Do you think this could be reoccurring? Or do you even worry about how the Mets handle him? Because wasn't it kind of weird, his injury history this past year? Wasn't he like coming back a little bit too soon, and then he got hurt again? Are you worried about his health at all going forward?
I think I'm less worried than others because I've seen some, and maybe this is just carryover from David Wright, but there's Mets fans that just think he's never going to pitch again just because of one injury-plagued year. And DeGrom throughout his career has been very durable. So I think there is a chance that he'll have a healthy season. It's still concerning, but that's what Max Scherzer does for the Mets. It provides you great insurance. The one thing I'll say about this team is it is an old team. And, their ceiling is very high, but yeah, you could see a couple injuries really derail them. I don't think that's changed unless they add a bunch of depth after we get, on the other side of the CBA.
Yeah, I want to ask you more about the Mets offseason plan, but the one guy that they got from this offseason they could really bet on is Max Scherzer. And if you want to place any bet, Ryan, you know where you have to go? You have to go to BetOnline because BetOnline has you covered all season. More props, odds, and lines than ever before as football season continues to march to the playoffs. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the sports action this season. Head to our new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Just use our promo code LOCKEDON to receive your bonus from basketball, football, NHL, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. Now, like I was saying, Max Scherzer is a guy you can bet on to come through for you in a big game, but when you look at the rest of the Mets offseason, what they could potentially do, what do you expect the rest of this offseason to look like for the Mets? Because they've already made a ton of moves that I want to talk about, but do you expect any other big moves to be coming? Do you expect another big fish to potentially come, another ace up the sleeve of Steve Cohen? Is this team done spending big money in free agency?
I don't think they're done spending for sure. I think there's two ways they can go about this. If this is just Billy Epler spending whatever is left in the budget and filling out the roster, it's going to be about adding pitching depth. They probably have to add another starter. They still haven't addressed their bullpen yet. They lost Aaron Luke. That's a big loss for that bullpen. So I think a lot of pitching still needs to be added. But this is still Steve Cohen. And Steve Cohen, as many have said, if he wants something, he's going to get it. So I don't know if I would say I'd be shocked. Let's put it this way. I would be surprised if they made another splash, but I would not be shocked. So if they were to sign Chris Bryant or something along those lines, that would just basically be Steve Cohen saying, look, I want this player. Let's go get him. And that can still happen when you have an owner that's the richest owner in the sport.
Are there any big fish out there that the Mets have been linked to that you're like, I could kind of see that one happening. That one kind of makes sense. Or any of them that you feel the strongest about that the Mets would go after if they want to go after another big fish?
So I think that name I just mentioned, Chris Bryant, would probably be that because they were linked to him throughout the season. And apparently reports were that Steve Cohen wanted both Javi Baez and Chris Bryant at the deadline. I think when Jacob deGrom got injured and they knew that he wasn't going to be part of the Mets, at least for the foreseeable future, ended up being the entire second half. I think maybe they were a little bit less all in to get both of those guys, and the Cubs decided it was better to split them up and do two separate trade packages. But there's been interest dating back to then, and there was also some reported interest right before the CBA expired. So that's the name they've been linked to. And of maybe the big name free agents, that's the one that maybe makes sense. But personally, I'm not the biggest fan of the signing because Chris Bryant's defense, to me, I'm concerned about that over a 7-year deal. And I just think that you have to be careful spending all your money at once. If the Mets want to be players in a couple of years and then you suddenly have a payroll where maybe Chris Bryant doesn't look great 2 years from now and Francisco Lindor continues to not perform up to the same level as he did when he was in Cleveland, now you're locking yourself in a bit. So I think the Mets would be smart not to give out another 7-8 year contract to Chris Bryant, but we'll see what happens. I mean, I can't deny the fact that the Mets lineup will look better with Chris Bryant in it. I'm not that delusional. I'm just concerned about the long-term implications.
Yeah, one reason that I wouldn't mind seeing Chris Bryant in that Mets lineup because it would mean he's no longer in the San Francisco Giants lineup, which I do not want to see any longer. adding him would be interesting. Of course, the defense, like you said, could be a little suspect, but it does help that he could play multiple different defensive positions, very versatile. That seems to be a kind of theme with the Mets. If they do get Chris Bryant, you got Eduardo Escobar, who's pretty versatile as well. So maybe that's kind of the direction they want to go. I know Jonathan Villar is a free agent for them, and he's been a pretty versatile defender throughout his career as well. But you mentioned Francisco Lindor. I'm looking at his numbers right now because I haven't really done a Lindor update since the season, and yeah, it's not as impressive of a season as what he was doing in the pre-Guardian days. So are you at all worried about Lindor and his production the first time in New York? Do you think it was just maybe some nerves being in a big city at all? Like how worried or nervous are you, if at all, about Francisco Lindor's future in New York?
I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that what we just saw is not going to happen again. I mean, he had a great September, hit 9 home runs, 25 RBIs down the stretch. And also, if you look at those numbers, he was so awful in the first, I'd say, 6 weeks of the season. If you pull those weeks out, the numbers look a lot better. So, I mean, if you were to look from, I'd say maybe, May 15th on, somewhere around there, I think his season looks a lot different. Overall, he still got on base a lot. You look at, and he didn't strike out a lot more. So it's not like he completely lost himself. He just, wasn't connecting on pitches for whatever reason. I think we're going to see a much better version next year. And the one thing I will say is I haven't seen defense like that from a Mets shortstop since I was like 6 years old watching Ray Ordonez. I mean, I watched so many years of Wilmer Flores at shortstop, or Asdrubal Cabrera, or 34-year-old Jose Reyes. Like, that was a completely different element to the Mets this year. Their defense got so much better, and Lindor was a huge part of that. So I think that is something that was really a big impact in the Mets having that lead in the first half where they were in first place for so long.
Yeah, and the injury is interesting with Lindor because this has been a guy that's been like supremely healthy throughout his career. So I don't think I'm really too worried about the injury issue that he had this past season. He's still only going to be 28 years old. His track record is pretty good. I want to see him get back into the power department. He got hot in the last month or the last couple of months of the season, like you said, but I think the power really just wasn't there most of the season for him. So I think I want to see him get back into that department for me to feel really confident about him. But like you said, his defense is going to be elite. He's going to be doing stuff for you on the base pass. And he has a lot of different elements to his game that can still make him a pretty good player, even if he's struggling at the plate a little bit. So Francisco Lindor, I think, is going to be a positive, no doubt, for you guys for the foreseeable future. But I want to talk about a little bit about the Mets offseason so far, because it's a weird offseason. They, of course, added a lot of guys, but they've also lost a few guys. So far through this early part, of course, we got the CBA lockout going on right now. Do you feel like the Mets have gotten better so far through free agency? I know Fangraphs think they've gotten better. And, of course, they've added some big-name players, in free agency with the Martes, Escobar, Scherzers, but they've also lost the Syndergaards, the Stromans, the Javi Baez, even a guy like Rich Hill or Aaron Loop, like you said. So as we're standing right now, do you actually feel like the Mets gotten better so far through the offseason so far if the regular season started today?
Yeah, I think so, especially with the knowledge that they're going to be doing some more. This was just the first wave of free agency. And I think if you look at it that way, I mean, they did such a great job. That outfield, it's the first time I can remember in a long time where they're going to have 3 actual outfielders out there. A lot of times there's been Dominic Smith in left field or J.D. Davis, converted infielders. Now you got Mark Canha in the left, most likely. I don't know how they're going to line it up. They could really put it out there however they want to. But Starling Marte is the big addition. I was talking about Starling Marte since the end of the season. That was the free agent I identified that made the most sense for the Mets, that they should be all in on. Because for one, he provides insurance if Brendan Nimmo, who's been injured a lot, goes down. But more importantly, I mean, even at his age, the guy's still one of the most athletic players in the sport, stole 47 bases this year. He's just going to bring a completely different dynamic to the team. And then the defense is really going to be something special. I think, Marte is an upgrade over Conforto. And then you add Canha to replace Dom out there. The Mets outfield got a lot better. And Eduardo Escobar as another addition in the infield, I think that is a perfectly capable starting player for you, as you're very familiar with. So I think that right now their infield, if just stays the same, is still pretty solid with Escobar, Lindor, McNeil, and Alonso.
Yeah, I love the two Mets offseason additions that were the former D-backs, of course, because one, Starling Marte is someone that I was super disappointed with when the Mets, not the Mets, when the D-backs traded him away because we only got him for literally a half a season and it was during the shortened season. So we literally only got him for like 15 games, it felt like, during the D-backs 2020 season. And everyone was hyping up the Marte parte, but unfortunately, half of it, Ketel Marte, wasn't very productive in 2020. But Starling Marte, I legitimately thought was the best D-backs player during that 2020 season because the whole lineup was struggling. Eduardo Escobar wasn't good in 2020. A lot of the D-backs players struggled across the board. Carson Kelly, Ketel Marte, they all struggled. But the one man who didn't was a Starling Marte, who I supremely respect. He batted .311 with 827 OPS in his short little stint in the D-backs uniform, only 33 games. So I think you're going to be very impressed with Starling Marte. I think I'm not even sure if he's underrated anymore because I think everyone knows how good Starling Marte is, but he had 47 steals last year. I think he might have been like top 3 in both the American League and the National League in stolen bases. So what he can do for you on the base pass as a top of the lineup kind of guy, what he can do for you just as a contact hitter at the plate, like you're not getting bad at bats when it comes to Starling Marte. He's always going to be a positive on the field. So I think you're going to end up liking him a lot. And Eduardo Escobar, he's someone too that just a huge personality. He does struggle when it comes to just getting on base consistently. He's like a career like 310 OBP, but as a middle of the order guy, he's going to be coming through for you in those run scoring opportunities. He's good in the cross matchups. He's a switch hitter too, so he's versatile. Like a Jonathan Villar, he can play multiple defensive positions. He might not be elite at any one defensive position, but the fact that he can play multiple is very good. He's going to get you like 35 home runs, and after those wins, he's going to be in the locker room posting videos on TikTok, got the whole crew dancing. Like he's a good clubhouse guy they're going to need. So I was really sad to see Eduardo Escobar get traded this season. I thought he needed to be traded just because he was going to be a pending free agent and the D-backs were not going to pay him, but I hated the return that they got back for Eduardo Escobar. So I wish they got a little bit more for a guy who I felt was really good. But I think the reason why Starling Marte is so fast is the socks he wears, Ryan. I think he wears Stance socks because if you didn't know, founded in 2009, Stance Apparel represents a radical reinvention of socks, underwear, and active apparel with a sharp focus on comfort, quality, and creativity. Stance brings in atypical aesthetic alongside some of pop culture's hottest collaborators for the ultimate in style and self-expression. I got me a pair of Stance socks. I think I'm going to be buying my brother a pair of Stance socks this Christmas because he loves Stance socks too. So I think I'm going to surprise his stocking with a little Stance. Stance believes that the perfect fit matters more than fitting in. That's for those who feel good and do good. Go see for yourself. Excuse me. I am butchering this Stance read. Register for an account at stance.com and get 15% off your first purchase. Use promo code LOCKEDON at checkout to apply. Enjoy the color and comfort of a life less ordinary with Stance. I'm sorry, Stance. I butchered that live read a little bit. There was a couple of typos in that live read, so I'm not going to say I'm taking all the blame here. But Ryan, let's get back into the conversation. And I just want to switch it up a little bit. Actually, I have one more question about the offseason before I ask you about the Hall of Fame and I get you out of here. The Mets have a whole bunch of free agents, their own free agents, pending free agents that are available right now on the market. And I think that some teams are going to be interested in them, like Michael Conforto, Jonathan Villar, Uris Familia. Do you see the Mets bringing back any of those guys? Because I think Conforto is the guy that a lot of people are going to be keeping their eyes on. He's not a superstar kind of player, but he's that kind of guy that could give you all-star level production without the all-star level price tag on some days. So do you feel like any of those Mets free agents could be coming back to the franchise after this lockout?
Conforto's definitely gone. They've added the 2 outfielders, and also the Mets get a comp pick back for giving him the qualifying offer. So that's even more incentive not to sign him at this point. So Conforto's gone, but the other 2 that you mentioned, I would not be surprised if either of them comes back. Jonathan Villar, if the Mets don't add another infielder or any position player, I guess, down the stretch of free agency, I could see them reuniting with Villar and having him come off the bench and getting some time all over the place again. Although I think he's probably going to be looking for a starting job somewhere. So I wouldn't say that's a likely possibility, but I just would say it is a possibility. Familia, I could definitely see in a Mets uniform again. Last time he was a free agent, He went right to the Mets and said, I wanted to come back. The Mets overpaid him in retrospect, as he did not have a good 3 years, but he definitely got better over the course of that last 3-year contract. I don't think he's going to cost a ton to bring back. You look at his stuff, it's still very good. He still throws hard, still has a ton of movement, still walks too many batters and gave up way too many home runs this year. But I think you can project that he's not going to give up that many home runs next season. And it's still a reliever that I think can give a team a 3.5 ERA and pitch 65 innings out of your bullpen, which is still very valuable. So that one I could see coming back for sure. VR, like I said, a little bit less of a possibility, but still a possibility.
Yeah, the reason I want to ask, because I wouldn't be upset if the D-backs want to go after any three of them. Conforto could be that high ceiling, high reward kind of a guy if the D-backs want to go after him, and he probably won't break the bank. I'm guessing he might have a little bit of an expensive price tag, but I don't think he'll break the bank like some other free agents. Maybe he'll look for that Starling Marte, Marcana, somewhere in that range kind of a deal. Jonathan Villar, D-backs desperately need some corner infield help, so maybe he could be an option too. They desperately need some bullpen help as well, so maybe Familia could be a target for them as well. So I've been looking at these Mets free agents as potential targets for the D-backs this offseason, because I think a lot of these Mets free agents fill the holes that the D-backs need. But I want to switch the conversation up a little bit and take it to the MLB Hall of Fame. I won't keep you too much longer, but there's a few players I want to ask you about. I got 6 written down. We could go through them really quickly each. And the first guy I want to talk to you about, it's going to be the most controversial guys on this ballot. I just kind of want to see where your head is compared to mine, because I haven't really talked to any other Locked On hosts about this year's MLB Hall of Fame ballot. So I just kind of want to know how other people feel about these controversial characters that we have on the ballot this year. So the first one is a Curt Schilling. I don't think I really have to give too long of a spiel about Curt Schilling, but really good regular season guy, bolstered by the postseason track record. But of course, his post-playing career has been mired in controversy, and he said a lot of disgusting things. But do you still believe the character clause should be enacted and he's not a Hall of Famer? Or do you just think he might not be a Hall of Famer because of the stats? Or you're like, you know what, screw the character clause. He was a great player during his prime. Let's put him in the Hall of Fame.
I usually tend to lean more towards play on the field. And I don't know. I don't want to say I'm an NBA Hall of Fame voter where everyone should be in, but I do think you need to remember some of the players that were a huge part of the game during their eras. And Curt Schilling, certainly boosted by his incredible performances in the playoffs, has a Hall of Fame resume. I would say that I'm less sold on him as a Hall of Famer as I am on some of the other controversial guys like Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds, where the two of them, to me, were just so much better than everyone in their era that it's just, I think, is this the last year on the ballot?
Yeah, I think this was their last year.
Yeah, and I don't think that they're going to get in. And I think that's a mistake. But yeah, Schilling's a little bit more of a toss-up for me, but a lot of these guys, I'm more likely to say yes based on the performance on the field.
Yeah, when it comes to the character clause, I apply it more, at least my interpretation of it, I apply it more to the player's career. So was he a bad guy during his career? Not really so much post-playing career, because, of course, like everyone else, I think, Locked On Network, on the MLB side, we all denounce anything Curt Schilling has said, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a great player during his prime. So I think personally for me, I've talked about on my pod, I would put Curt Schilling in my Hall of Fame, but you mentioned Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, of course, highly suspected steroid users. And I think we kind of know at this point that they did do steroids. But for you, do you not really care about the steroids for when it comes to Hall of Fame? Or do you have like certain gray areas for it? Because for me, I'm all about the Mitchell Report. Prior to 2007, the Mitchell Report coming out, if you did steroids pre-Mitchell Report, I do not care. You should be a Hall of Famer. But if you've tested positive and been suspended post-Mitchell Report, when baseball's really cared about this crackdown, then I don't think you should be a Hall of Famer. So basically, the Manny Ramirez's, the A-Rods for me, they don't qualify. But Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens, they would be in my Hall of Fame because it was pre-Mitchell Report. So for you, how do you feel about that logic? And do you care at all about steroids when it comes to Hall of Fame voting?
It's definitely tough. I agree with a lot of what you just said there. Like A-Rod is his stats are obviously Hall of Fame worthy, but he got suspended, 2-3 times? I mean,
he's been suspended twice, I think.
Yeah.
Or he's been technically suspended once, but he admitted to using steroids back when he was on the Rangers.
Yeah. And so it's really tough. The one thing I'll say is Are we going to penalize the guys that were doing greenies in the 80s or all the other ways that players have been cheating all these years? Baseball has a history of cheating. That's just the reality. And so it's you have to take a case-by-case basis. And so if we're talking about Clemens and Bonds, I think their case is just so much – it's so overwhelming that they were Hall of Famers that I would put them in. You look at Sammy Sosa, never tested positive, but if you look at his career trajectory – it does seem like steroids were what made Sammy Sosa who he was. So with that, I would not have Sosa in. McGwire is like another tough one because I think, he had some years in Oakland where he probably wasn't on the juice and was performing like a Hall of Famer. But, what do you take from all those years in St. Louis? So it really is case by case. When it comes to the steroid guys, again, for me, Clemens and Bonds are the two that I'm most hell-bent on that they should be in the Hall of Fame.
Okay, and I kind of put Sosa in my Hall of Fame too for the same reasons I put Bonds and Clemens in when it comes to the, prior to the Mitchell report. He never tested positive, so I don't mind putting him in, even though, like you said, you can kind of just tell, like, if you look at his baseball references, like, all right, he's a 20, 25 home run guy. Then he hits age 32. All of a sudden, he's a 65 home run guy for the next 4 years. So it's definitely interesting. But another reason why I want to put Sosa in is because of what you said earlier about having the stars in the Hall of Fame that meant something to the game. That 98 home run race with Mark McGwire where they were trying to go for 70, that was one of the greatest seasons in baseball history. He carried the sport. He was a face of the sport. And because of that, we can't erase the history of what he meant to baseball. So I feel like Sammy Sosa has to be in, even though we know he did steroids. If you want to just say cheaters shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame, I can't really argue with that. But I think there's a bunch of cheaters already in the Hall of Fame. There's been guys who have admitted to using steroids in the Hall of Fame. There's guys who were using steroids back when they were legal, like you said, in the 80s, that are now retroactively illegal, and we're not taking those guys out the Hall of Fame. So I'm kind of in on all the controversial guys going into the Hall of Fame. But I got one final guy I want to ask you about, and that is David Ortiz, who kind of falls in the middle of all this. He's tested positive according to the Mitchell report, but never tested positive post-Mitchell report. So how do you feel about a Big Papi who is also just the DH? Like, he has played more games at DH than I think anyone else who would be elected into the Hall of Fame. So he's not really getting those defensive metrics. Where do you stand on Big Papi, Hall of Famer or not?
I have huge bias on Big Papi. Who wasn't a Big Papi fan?
There we go.
Around our age. I'm sorry. The guy was awesome. He was awesome in the playoffs. He's an awesome personality. I think because he's so beloved, he has a better chance than a lot of these guys to get in, because I think, if you're trying to play out this morality clause and you're trying to decide, I think you're just going to think about Big Papi, and voters are just going to tend to check that box and want him in the Hall. I think that, his reputation off the field is just so spectacular that I think that people are going to ignore, the Mitchell report. And also, he was going through testing for all those later stages of his career. Even his last season, the guy could barely run or even walk, and he's still hitting over 300. I think that guy, you put him in the box, he'd still hit 2 for 4 today. So, yeah, David Ortiz to me is a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, Big Papi, for anyone who needs to look it up, go look up his last season in baseball. He was like 40 years old and he was maybe a top 5 player in baseball that year, at least from a position player standpoint at the plate. Like, he was phenomenal. Big Papi, I think, gets lumped in a lot of times with A-Rod when we look at this Hall of Fame conversation because of the Mitchell report. They allegedly both tested positive earlier. I actually found out doing some research that they both were on the same Dominican team when they were teenagers. So these two have kind of been linked at the hip basically throughout their whole career. One played on the Red Sox, one played on the Yankees, of course. But when you look at the main difference to me between these two is basically the personality. Like, A-Rod at every turn, no one liked A-Rod. You had managers call him a fraud. You had people call him other nicknames. His teammates didn't like him. His managers didn't like him. Heck, Yankee fans only loved him during the 2009 season after the World Series. And then as soon as that biogenesis scandal came up, they were back off the A-Rod bandwagon. So right then and there, Big Papi, the man who rallied the Boston community around the marathon bombing, this man has meant so much to the city of Boston. He's been such a bigger-than-life personality. Like you said, I'm totally biased toward Big Papi. Grew up on the East Coast. I love Big Papi, watching him growing up. I'm a huge fan. So Big Papi is definitely a Hall of Famer for me. A-Rod is not. But is there anyone else on the ballot that we didn't talk about today that you feel might be getting overlooked or that you feel strongly as a Hall of Famer that maybe others don't feel about?
For me, it's been Billy Wagner for a long time. I mean, Billy Wagner's numbers are just ridiculous. You compare what he did, and the fact is the sample size is just smaller than some other Hall of Famers. But, I mean, you can make an argument, one of the most dominant left-handed relievers of all time, one of the best closers of all time. And I think it's a shame he's not in the Hall yet. And probably won't get in either, honestly.
Yeah, I was looking. His numbers are pretty insane. If you think Joe Nathan or Jonathan Papelbon's a Hall of Famer, I think you basically have to put Billy Wagner in the Hall of Fame too. Basically, all three of those guys are top 10 in career saves. Like, I don't know what more you have to do to be a Hall of Fame closer than to finish top 10 in saves for your career. I feel like that's kind of all you need. So I would probably put Billy Wagner in my Hall of Fame. I did my Hall of Fame ballot on my pod yesterday. I didn't have Billy Wagner on there, but the only reason is because I was more biased toward players I watched growing up. I didn't really get into baseball. I didn't really get into baseball until like around 2009, 2010. So I didn't get a chance to see a ton of Billy Wagner's career. That's the only reason why I didn't have him on. But just looking from a statistical standpoint, he's probably a Hall of Famer. Again, he's like top 10 in saves all time. But
let me throw two stats at you real quick here.
Okay.
2.31 career ERA for Billy Wagner, 11.9 strikeouts per 9. The guy was unbelievably dominant.
Yeah, the dude was dominant for there was 8-9 year run where he was basically like a 2.5 guy or lower every season. Like, Billy Wagner was definitely a stud in his prime. I also think a Jonathan Papelbon and Joe Nathan should be in as well. Nathan's a weird one because he didn't become like a closer until like the age of 29, but it one of the best 7-year stretches in a closer's history, of any closer in MLB history. He had one of the best 7-year stretches ever. And Jonathan Papelbon, same kind of deal, but I think he's kind of like a Kurt Schilling, really good regular season. But if you go look at Papelbon's postseason, he didn't give up an earned run through his first 17 outings. He only has one outing in his entire postseason career where he gave up an earned run. So I think all the closers on this year's ballot are Hall of Famers, even though they might seem like fringe guys. I think if you really dive into the numbers, you might change your mind on that opinion. Ryan, I'm going to get you out of here today. I've had you on for a hot minute, over 30 minutes now. But before I let you go, the Lockdown listeners who are not watching this on YouTube, where can they find you online, social media, YouTube? Where can they find you, Ryan?
So, yeah, they can find Locked On Mets just by searching that on YouTube. You can find us wherever you find Locked On Diamondbacks. You can find me on Twitter at Finklestein Ryan. You can find the show at Locked On Mets.
Ryan, thank you for hopping on today. Thank you for giving me your time today because I know it's late out there on the East Coast. I'm working on the West Coast. So I always appreciate these cross-country crossovers because I know you guys have to stay up late for me. So I really appreciate it, Ryan.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on.
That is Ryan Finklestein of Locked On Mets. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to today's edition of the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Come back next week for more Diamondbacks news coverage and insight. We're going to have more pods, of course. Thank you for making Locked On Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be doing this podcast without you, the listener, free and available on all platforms. Thank you. And as always, please stay safe and stay healthy out there. Deuces!